for me, the blood libel rivalries here are, college foot. It's Hatfield and McCoys, which are real people.
Hmm.
And this is the college football. This is where that kind of blood libel rivalry is. So the idea of um, a protagonist antagonist in the soccer that little pitch I read seemed that was interesting to me. Um,
Well, I think that it's fair to say, and I've certainly written about this a lot since the book is out, is that the period of the late 80s and early 90s really introduced the internationalism of sport to America. And I say that because up to that time, nobody really followed any sport in an international way. All of our competitions are domestic,
mhm.
the NBA, college football, football itself. Baseball is played by people overseas, but we don't play them as America. They come here to play, and that's fine. But the 1989 men's national team, the soccer national team, and the women's team in '91, they sort of showed us how this worked. They said, you can root for America against other countries in sport outside of the Olympic Games.
Right.
Um,
The Russians were
and
such a good foil for so long, and all of their satellites,
right.
that's all we knew.
Right. That's the only context we had. It was an interesting, fun context as far as it went. It wasn't really a team thing, though, only rarely. The U.S. Hockey team in 1980 was the best example of how we were like, oh, this is fun, rooting for our American boys or girls against another. But we didn't follow up on that in any way. So it's been the men's hockey team in the late 80s and 90 and 94, especially when we hosted the World Cup, along with crucially the NBA dream,
Right.
showed Americans how it worked, how it could be fun, how it's actually useful to mobilize your jingoism about this country in a relatively frivolous and fun way. And I think that we've gone from strength to strength in this regard, and soccer's rise since the early 90s has risen with it.
Getting to the early 90s was in, I loved the book because it was all new to me. I mean, I'm on the tail end of your Gen X cohort. Okay. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
79 kid. So for me, the introduction to soccer, the only people I knew were, I mean, I'd heard of Pele, but it was Kobe Jones and Tony Miola. Oh, he's the guy that got an NFL tryout, and Alexi Lawless with the crazy hair.
Yeah.
That 94 team, and that mirrored what I knew of soccer players in my town. They were the kids that didn't play the big three sports. They didn't look like me. It was almost it was like I was reliving in middle America was reliving the 50s again. You either had the crew cut, the Notre Dame haircut, football playing all American kids, or you had the guys with the leather jackets and the grease, slicked back. And that was
Mm-hmm.
the divide for me growing up between soccer players and everyone else. So to have through generation zero to kind of have that roadmap of how we got there and how it all changed was really fascinating. First thing I want you to talk about on this, when in the process or how in the process you tell there's a lot of there's a first person element to the book, which I wasn't expecting and I absolutely loved. It's a good hook, to for an American reading the book. So talk to me a little bit about how, because it's not just a straight history, kind of biographical thing of the guys that were involved. Tell me how that conception kind of came and how you ran with it.
Right. Well, that is a conceit of the book. The main characters, all these members of the U.S. national team in 1989 and 90, they're exactly my age. So we had the same exact experience being born in the 1960s and raised as the country's first soccer natives in the 70s. We all had that experience. But beyond that, these guys billeted in my house. I mean, I knew them. I competed against them as a 12-year-old. I competed against them in college. Competed with and against them, in the semi-pro leagues, in the absence of post NASL, pre MLS. because we were all in our, physical primes. I was born in 64. In 1990, I was 26 years old. So at the time, I knew this intellectually, but it's not like, hey, there's Bruce Murray. He stayed in my house. I have a connection to them. I was into soccer, and they were the sort of emblem of our soccer capability, our emerging. So that was where it was. But when I started writing the book, I was like, oh, wow, this is their story is my story, and my story is their story.
Okay. That it makes sense and it makes it more interesting.
All had the same experiences of being on youth teams with coaches, someone's dad who didn't know anything about soccer. And that's so weird when you think about it, because I played little league baseball, I played a bunch of little league basketball. The idea that the coach didn't know anything about the sport that he was coaching you was weird.
That's me. That is where we are as a nation. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. I coach them both in soccer. We're getting ready to start indoor soccer. Our first,
Right.
they tried futsal last year. We're moving to Lexington. Actually, has Lexington Soccer Club, so they're graciously hosting it this winter.
Right.
I watch EPL games. I watch the World Cup. I understand spacing a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but if
Yeah.
you, it, you know, it, I can show you how to dribble a basketball between my legs. I can't show you how to to dribble a soccer ball other than forward. So you do give a shout out to that in the book. They're kind of the background yeoman of, it wasn't in minivans. I don't think you had minivans in the 70s. You had station wagons,
We had giant wood paneled station wagons.
two redwoods on each side. Right.
Yes.
Um, so I
Thank you,
appreciate that
family.
as the lineal descendant of all those dads. I do appreciate the shout out, but what is the scene compared today? Because there are still the youth soccer revolution is still going on. The
Mm-hmm.
byproduct of all these men you talk about in Generation Zero is still happening, and there are still flat grass fields flooded with unknowing, well-meaning dads and moms to some extent. Did they in the moment? You talk about uh, the predecessor, was it North American Soccer League, and
Yep.
those guys were rock stars. And you talk about the clinics. The big hook was around where you grew up, around the suburbs. You had the stars from the Boston-based team that would
Yep.
give a clinic. In the moment, did those guys know that they were really pushing the game forward, that they were on the verge of that fulfilled promise, like Raj says, America's sport and waiting since 72. Did they
Right.
have any idea?
Yeah, they did. But they also knew the limitations of what they were doing. I mean, they knew that, yes, wow, we're playing professional soccer in America, but they also recognized that, the league was being propped up, by larger entities, not actual fan interest, and that, oh, only two Americans are playing on every team at all times by fiat, just so that they would be participating as a marketing ploy and a weird sort of development strategy. They knew it, but they weren't surprised when the NASL failed either in 1984. And I guess what a lot of people don't, the disconnect for me is, and a lot of people, including the guys on the '89 team that I talked to, was they would have thought that in the '70s and '80s, the national team especially would have been better, because all these guys have been playing in NASL, all these Americans, but they weren't good, and that's a long discussion that we can get into if you want. But there was no mainstreaming. Like, one of the things that I think is unique about the book is that it's a where, where, why, when, and how deal. There's been renewed interest in Generation Zero because there's been a show on Paramount Plus called The $1 Billion Goal. Grant Wall, the soccer
Hmm.
writer who passed away a year ago, did a bunch of interviews on the subject, more or less after he read my book, about, this story and how it's not been told enough, and the story of, this '89 team. And that was really the tipping point. It took until 1989 and '90 to mainstream the sport.
Right.
But the thrust of the book is that you can't just mainstream a sport by starting a league. You can't just mainstream a sport by hosting a World Cup. What you need to do is what did what America did do in the 70s. You get the kids when they're young.